Some places are abandoned for a reason. Others are abandoned because somebody wanted the truth buried with them. The wind rolled cold through the Nevada Canyon as Caleb Turner stood alone before the cave house carved into the side of the rock wall. The old structure looked less like a home and more like something the desert itself had swallowed and forgotten. Cracked wooden beams leaned crooked beneath a limestone overhang. Rusted lantern hooks creaked softly in the evening breeze. Half the windows were boarded shut. The other half stared out dark and hollow like tired eyes that had seen too much. Beside Caleb, Atlas stood perfectly still. The German shepherd's sable coat shifted gently under the fading orange light, his amber eyes fixed on the cave entrance without blinking. A faint growl vibrated low in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. Caleb adjusted the worn canvas duffel hanging from his shoulder and glanced down at the folded auction receipt in his hand. $400. That was all it had taken to buy the place nobody else wanted. $400 for a collapsed cave house 20 miles outside a dying mining town called Blackstone Ridge. $400 for the last thing he owned in this world. The desert smelled like dust, cold stone, and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, thunder rolled softly across the empty land. Caleb exhaled slowly. At 34 years old, he looked older than he should have. His broad frame still carried the posture of law enforcement, but grief had worn the sharpness down around the edges. His dark brown hair had grown longer than regulation allowed, streaked faintly with exhaustion at the temples. A faded scar crossed beneath his jawline, barely visible beneath the rough stubble that shadowed his face. Once, he had been respected. A decorated canine officer in Reno. The kind of man trusted to walk into danger while others stepped back. But life had a quiet way of stripping titles from people. First came the injury to his shoulder during a mountain search operation. Then the medical leave. Then the bills. Then the silence from everyone who once called him brother. In less than a year, Caleb Turner lost his badge, his apartment, and nearly his sense of purpose. Everything except Atlas. The dog had never left. Not through the sleepless nights in the truck stop parking lots. Not through the mornings when Caleb skipped meals so Atlas could eat first. Not even through the freezing December storm when the heater in his old Ford finally died somewhere outside Carson City. Atlas stayed through all of it. Because loyalty like that does not come from training alone. It comes from love. Caleb stepped toward the cave house porch, the old boards groaning softly beneath his boots. Atlas followed close beside him, ears forward now, nose working slowly against the cold air. The heavy wooden front door hung slightly open. Someone had nailed a crooked sign above it years ago. Turn back. Caleb stared at the words for a long moment before pushing the door inward. The smell inside hit immediately. Damp stone, old smoke, rust, and beneath it all, something else. Something buried deep beneath the years. Atlas froze beside the doorway. His body stiffened. Then slowly, the German shepherd turned his head toward the darkness deeper inside the cave and released a low, uneasy rumble that echoed softly through the stone halls like a warning from the past. The beam from Caleb's flashlight swept slowly across the cave walls, revealing veins of pale quartz running through the stone like old scars beneath skin. Dust floated through the cold air in soft silver ribbons. Somewhere deeper inside the house, water dripped steadily into darkness with the slow rhythm of a clock no one remembered winding. Atlas stayed close to Caleb's leg, moving carefully across the uneven floorboards. The old German shepherd was trained to search abandoned buildings, but tonight his movements felt different. Slower, focused, like he was listening for something too distant for human ears. Caleb stepped into what had once been the living room. A rusted wood stove sat crooked in the corner beside a collapsed leather chair coated in gray dust. Shelves carved directly into the cave walls still held remnants of another life. Empty mason jars, tarnished silverware, a cracked coffee mug with the faded shape of an American flag across the side. Someone had lived here for years once, maybe decades. Then one day they had simply stopped. The silence inside the cave house carried a strange weight. Not threatening, just lonely. Caleb set his duffel bag near the wall and rubbed both hands together against the cold. The temperature inside the cave stayed nearly 45 degrees year-round according to the auction listing, but standing there now, it felt colder than that. The kind of cold that settled into old memories. Atlas wandered toward the hallway carved deeper into the stone. His nails clicked softly against rock before stopping completely. Caleb looked up. The dog stood frozen beside a narrow tunnel leading farther underground. His ears rose sharply forward. Then came the low growl again. Caleb frowned. "What is it, buddy?" Atlas did not move. Caleb walked toward him slowly, flashlight beam gliding across the rough cave walls. The tunnel ahead looked older than the rest of the structure. The stone changed color there, darker and smoother from years of moisture. Faint wooden support beams lined the passage every few feet. Old mining timber. Caleb felt his stomach tighten slightly. Blackstone Ridge used to be a silver mining town nearly 70 years earlier before the tunnels collapsed and the companies vanished. Most people left after that. The rest stayed behind long enough to grow bitter. He remembered hearing stories at the diner before the auction. Stories about missing workers, disappearing land deeds, men who drank too much and swore the mountains remembered everything buried beneath them. Caleb never believed ghost stories, but he believed silence. And places like this carried too much of it. Atlas stepped into the tunnel at last. Slowly, deliberately. Caleb followed, ducking slightly beneath the low ceiling. The smell changed immediately. Less dust, more earth, damp stone mixed with something metallic beneath it. The flashlight beam caught old pickaxe marks carved into the walls. Then something else. Words. Caleb stopped. Faded lettering scratched directly into the stone beside one of the support beams. June 18th, 1974. Beneath the date were 3 initials. E. M. R. Caleb brushed his fingers lightly over the carving. The grooves were deep enough to survive half a century underground. Atlas suddenly moved ahead faster now, tail rigid behind him. His breathing changed. Sharp and alert. Caleb quickened his pace. The tunnel opened into a small hidden chamber no bigger than a storage room. A broken lantern hung from a nail overhead. Rotting crates sat stacked against the far wall. Most had collapsed inward from moisture and time. Atlas ignored all of it. Instead, the German shepherd walked directly toward the rear corner of the chamber and began pawing softly at the dirt floor beneath a section of loose stone. Caleb knelt beside him. "Easy." Atlas whined quietly without looking away. Caleb pulled his flashlight closer and brushed away dirt with his hand. Beneath the loose gravel sat the edge of something metal. His heartbeat slowed, then deepened. He cleared more dirt carefully until the shape became visible. A small iron lockbox, rusted nearly black with age. Atlas stepped back at last, watching silently as Caleb stared down at the buried box hidden beneath the cave for who knew how many years. And for the first time since arriving in Blackstone Ridge, Caleb no longer felt like he had bought an abandoned house. It felt like the house had been waiting for someone to come back. Caleb carried the lockbox upstairs with both hands, careful not to force the rusted hinges apart too quickly. Fine grains of dirt slipped from the metal edges onto the old wooden table near the stove while Atlas settled beside the doorway, still watching the dark hallway carve deeper into the cave. Outside, the desert wind pressed softly against the canyon walls, carrying the dry whisper of sagebrush across the night. The storm never fully arrived. Only distant thunder remained, rolling low beyond the mountains like a memory refusing to fade. Caleb found an old screwdriver in one of the kitchen drawers and worked carefully at the corroded latch. The metal resisted at first, then suddenly gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the cave house. Atlas lifted his head immediately. Caleb froze for a moment, listening. Silence answered him. He slowly opened the lid. Inside the box, wrapped beneath layers of yellowed cloth, sat pieces of another man's life. A silver pocket watch stopped at exactly 9:17. A faded photograph of 3 men standing beside a mining truck sometime during the 1970s. All smiling, all covered in dust. One of them wore a sheriff's department jacket. Beneath the photo rested several folded documents tied together with worn leather cord. Caleb carefully untied the bundle. Land deeds, survey maps, letters. Most carried the same name written neatly across the top corner. Elijah Mercer Reed. Caleb stared at the initials. EMR. The ones carved into the tunnel wall. Atlas rose quietly and walked toward the table, nose lowering toward the old papers. The German shepherd sniffed once, then rested his chin gently against Caleb's knee. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ear absent-mindedly while unfolding another document. This one was different. A newspaper clipping dated October 3rd, 1974. Local miner disappears after land dispute. Caleb read the article slowly beneath the weak lantern light. Elijah Reed owned part of the canyon land before the mining company expansion began. According to the article, Reed accused several businessmen in Blackstone Ridge of falsifying ownership records to force families off their property. Weeks later, he vanished. No body was ever found. The town assumed he left voluntarily. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Something about the story felt wrong. People rarely abandoned everything overnight, especially not someone who carved dates into stone walls deep beneath his own home. Atlas suddenly lifted his head again. His ears twitched toward the front door. A second later came the faint crunch of gravel outside. Caleb stood immediately. Every instinct from his years in canine search operations returned at once, quiet and sharp beneath the surface. He lowered the lantern flame slightly and stepped toward the dusty front window. A pair of headlights moved slowly near the road below the canyon ridge. An old pickup truck. It idled for a few seconds without approaching the house, then drove off into the darkness. Caleb frowned. Atlas remained perfectly still beside him, eyes fixed toward the canyon entrance long after the lights disappeared. "You saw that too, huh?" Caleb murmured softly. Atlas gave a low breath through his nose. Caleb looked back toward the papers spread across the table. The deeper he stepped into this place, the less abandoned it felt. Somebody still cared what remained buried here. He unfolded the final letter inside the lockbox carefully, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting trembled slightly across the page. "If anything happens to me, do not trust Walter Grayson. He owns the sheriff. He owns the mine, and he will bury anyone who stands in his way." Caleb's eyes narrowed slowly. He recognized the name immediately. Grayson Mining Company still operated outside Blackstone Ridge to this day. And according to the auction records, the company once tried to buy this exact property before suddenly withdrawing the offer 6 months earlier. Atlas released another low growl, this time not toward the tunnel, toward the window overlooking the canyon road. Morning arrived slowly over Blackstone Ridge, pale sunlight spilling across the canyon walls in thin bands of gold that never fully reached the cave house entrance. The air carried the sharp scent of dry cedar and cold stone. Caleb had barely slept. The old letter remained unfolded beside the lantern while Atlas lay awake near the front door throughout the night, ears twitching at every distant sound drifting through the canyon. Around 6:30, Caleb poured black coffee into the cracked mug he found on the shelf and stepped outside onto the porch. The desert stretched wide and silent beneath the early dawn haze. Far below, the small town rested between the hills like something time forgot to finish. Faded rooftops, empty storefronts, rusted trucks parked beside weather-beaten diners. Blackstone Ridge had the look of a place that survived mostly on memory. Atlas emerged quietly beside him, sable fur glowing faintly beneath the morning light. Caleb rubbed the dog's neck gently. "You know something about this place, do you not?" Atlas stared toward town without blinking. An hour later, Caleb drove the old Ford pickup down the winding canyon road with Atlas seated in the passenger seat beside him. Dust rolled behind the tires in long pale clouds. The deeper they descended toward town, the more signs of Grayson Mining Company appeared. Billboards, equipment yards, old silver logos painted onto water towers and warehouse walls. Walter Grayson might have been dead for years, but his name still owned the valley. Caleb parked outside a diner called Rosie's Kitchen, the same place where the auction had been held 3 nights earlier. A bell chimed softly when he stepped inside. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee filled the air. Country music crackled low from an old radio near the counter. A few locals glanced up briefly before returning to their meals. Caleb recognized the look immediately. Outsider. Atlas walked calmly beside him, drawing more attention than Caleb did. The German shepherd moved with quiet discipline, alert but gentle. A waitress in her 60s approached carrying a coffee pot. Her silver hair was tied beneath a faded blue scarf, and deep lines framed her tired eyes. "You are the fellow who bought the cave place," she said softly before Caleb even spoke. Caleb nodded once. "That obvious?" The woman poured coffee into a chipped mug near the counter. "People notice things around here, especially when somebody buys property nobody else will touch." Caleb sat slowly while Atlas settled beside the stool. "Why will nobody touch it?" The woman hesitated just long enough for Caleb to notice. Then she sighed quietly. "Because people still remember Elijah Reed." The name settled heavily in the room. Even the old man eating toast near the window glanced up briefly before lowering his eyes again. Caleb leaned forward slightly. You knew him? Everybody knew him. Her voice softened. Good man. Former Marine. Worked search rescue during the mine collapse back in '72. Saved 6 men trapped underground. She stared toward the coffee pot for a moment, as though seeing another lifetime reflected inside it. Then one day folks started saying he was unstable, dangerous, claimed he threatened the mining company. Caleb frowned. And you believe that? The woman gave a faint, humorless smile. No, but rich men do not need truth. Only enough people willing to stay quiet. Atlas suddenly lifted his head, the dog's eyes fixed toward the diner window. A black SUV rolled slowly past outside before disappearing farther down Main Street. Caleb noticed the waitress watching it too. Her expression tightened. You should leave that place alone, she whispered carefully. Some stories buried in these mountains do not stay buried kindly. Caleb pulled the folded letter from his jacket pocket and placed it gently on the counter beside her. Her face lost color almost instantly when she recognized the handwriting. Where did you get this? Inside the cave house. Her fingers trembled slightly above the paper without touching it. Lord have mercy. Caleb lowered his voice. Who was Walter Grayson really? The woman looked toward the front door first, then toward the old men seated near the window. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Finally, she leaned closer. Walter Grayson owned the mine, the sheriff, the bank, and most of the town council. But Elijah Reed had something Walter wanted. Caleb felt his pulse slow carefully beneath his chest. What? The woman's eyes shifted toward Atlas for a brief moment before returning to Caleb. Proof. Atlas released a low rumble beneath the counter. Outside the diner window, the same black SUV had returned and parked quietly across the street. The black SUV remained parked across from the diner long after Caleb finished his coffee. Its windows were dark enough to reflect the pale desert sky, like black mirrors. Nobody stepped out. Nobody waved. It simply sat there quietly, engine running, as if waiting for him to make the next move. Caleb folded Elijah Reed's letter carefully and slid it back into his jacket pocket. The waitress leaned closer before walking away. If you are smart, she whispered softly, you will pretend you never found anything. Caleb gave a faint nod, but deep down he already knew that was impossible now. Atlas rose beside him the moment Caleb stood. The German shepherd's posture stayed calm, though his eyes never left the SUV outside the window. Caleb paid for the coffee and stepped back into the dry morning air. The heat was beginning to rise off the pavement now, carrying the smell of dust, gasoline, and sun-baked wood through Main Street. The SUV slowly pulled away the second Caleb reached his truck. No hurry, no confrontation, just a quiet reminder that somebody was watching. Caleb drove back toward the canyon with one hand resting lightly near Atlas's shoulder. The dog sat alert beside him, ears forward, gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. 20 minutes later, the cave house came back into view beneath the cliffs, lonely and silent against the stone walls. But something felt wrong immediately. Caleb slowed the truck near the porch. The front door stood partially open. He knew he had shut it before leaving town. Atlas noticed it too. His body stiffened instantly. A low growl rolled through his chest. Caleb killed the engine quietly and stepped out. The canyon wind moved softly through the sagebrush around them. No voices, no movement, just silence hanging heavy beneath the afternoon sun. Caleb approached carefully while Atlas moved ahead beside the porch steps. The old boards creaked beneath their weight. Inside, the cave house looked untouched at first glance. Dust still coated the shelves. The lantern still sat on the table. But Caleb's eyes immediately found the difference. The papers from the lockbox were no longer stacked where he left them. Somebody had moved them. Not stolen. Examined. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Atlas walked deeper into the room, nose low to the floor. The dog followed a scent trail toward the rear hallway before stopping suddenly beside the stone wall near the kitchen shelves. Then he barked once. Sharp. Certain. Caleb stepped closer. Atlas pawed at the bottom shelf built directly into the cave wall. Caleb frowned and pulled aside several old jars covered in dust. Behind them sat a narrow crack in the stone barely visible in the dim light. Atlas whined softly now, tail rigid behind him. Caleb ran his fingers along the crack until they brushed against something hidden inside. Metal. He pulled carefully. A small leather pouch slid free from the darkness. The leather felt dry and brittle with age. Caleb opened it slowly. Inside rested a silver key attached to an old military dog tag. Elijah M. Reed, U.S. Marine Corps. Caleb stared at the tag while Atlas sat quietly beside him, watching. The edges of the metal were worn smooth from years of handling. On the back, barely visible beneath scratches and age, were 4 engraved numbers. September 17th, 72. Caleb's pulse slowed. The same time stopped on the pocket watch inside the lockbox. 9:17. Something happened that day. Something important enough for Elijah Reed to carve into memory over and over again. Atlas suddenly turned toward the tunnel leading underground. His ears snapped forward. Then came the sound. Faint. Metallic. Somewhere deep beneath the cave house. Caleb froze completely. The sound came again. A soft clank against stone, distant but unmistakable. Atlas moved first, rising immediately and stepping toward the tunnel entrance with focused intensity. Caleb grabbed the flashlight from the table. Easy, buddy. But Atlas was already staring into the darkness beneath the mountain like he recognized the sound from somewhere older than instinct. Caleb switched on the flashlight and followed him into the tunnel once more. The deeper they walked, the colder the air became. Water dripped steadily through unseen cracks overhead. Their footsteps echoed softly across the old mining passage. Then Atlas stopped near the hidden chamber again. Not at the lockbox this time. At the far wall behind the broken crates. The German shepherd pressed his nose against the stone and released a low, urgent whine. Caleb swept the flashlight upward slowly. The beam caught something wedged between the rocks near the ceiling. A wooden sign nearly hidden beneath decades of dust. Property Records Vault B. Caleb felt his breath catch slightly in his throat. And for the first time, he realized Elijah Reed had not been hiding memories inside this mountain. He had been protecting evidence. Caleb lifted the flashlight higher toward the faded wooden sign, while Atlas remained planted beneath it, muscles tense beneath his sable coat. Dust drifted softly through the beam like pale smoke. The old tunnel felt narrower now, the air heavier with moisture and forgotten years. Property Records Vault B. The words looked official once, painted in white block letters nearly erased by time. Caleb stepped closer to the wall beneath the sign and brushed his hand across the rough stone. Unlike the surrounding rock, this section sounded hollow when he knocked against it. Atlas immediately pawed once at the lower corner. Caleb crouched beside him. You found another door, did you not? The German shepherd stared back at him silently, amber eyes reflecting the flashlight glow. Caleb searched the edges carefully until his fingers caught a thin metal seam buried beneath dust and mineral stains. An old handle, nearly invisible. He wrapped both hands around it and pulled hard. At first nothing moved. Then slowly, with the deep, grinding groan of rusted hinges, part of the stone wall shifted inward. Cold air poured from the darkness behind it, carrying the scent of old paper, damp wood, and something strangely preserved beneath the years. Caleb stepped inside carefully while Atlas moved beside him without hesitation. The hidden room beyond was larger than he expected. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with metal boxes, rolled maps, ledgers, and wooden file drawers warped from age. A single lantern hung from the ceiling hook overhead, long dead but untouched. The place felt frozen in time, not abandoned, protected. Caleb swept the flashlight slowly across the shelves until something stopped him cold. An American flag folded neatly inside a glass case rested against the far wall. Beneath it sat a framed photograph coated in dust. Caleb walked closer. The picture showed Elijah Reed standing beside a younger German shepherd outside the cave house decades earlier. Elijah looked to be in his 40s, broad-shouldered, sunburned, wearing worn denim and an old Marine Corps jacket. Beside him sat the dog, alert and proud beneath the desert sunlight. Caleb felt something tighten quietly inside his chest. The same look, the same loyalty he saw every day in Atlas. You were not alone either, he murmured softly. Atlas stepped toward the photograph and sniffed lightly near the frame before sitting beside Caleb's leg. Caleb opened one of the metal file boxes nearby. Inside rested dozens of documents sealed carefully in wax-lined envelopes. Property deeds, survey records, mining permits. Caleb unfolded one at random and immediately saw the problem. Several signatures did not match. Dates had been altered. Entire parcels of land transferred under suspicious approvals. Elijah Reed had not been paranoid. He had uncovered fraud large enough to steal half the canyon from local families. Caleb continued digging through the records while the silence around them deepened. Then he found a small leather journal tucked beneath the final drawer. Elijah's handwriting filled every page in tight, careful lines. September 14th, 1972. Walter says the collapse was an accident. But I know what I heard underground that night. Caleb's eyes narrowed slowly. He turned the page. There are tunnels beneath Grayson Mine they never reported to the county. Unsafe supports. Illegal blasting. Men trapped down there did not die because of bad luck. They died because Walter Grayson wanted silver faster than safety. Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. The room suddenly felt colder around him. Atlas lifted his head sharply toward the tunnel entrance behind them. A sound echoed faintly through the cave. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Caleb closed the journal immediately and killed the flashlight beam. Darkness swallowed the room except for the thin gray glow leaking beneath the hidden doorway. Atlas stood silently now beside him, ears raised high, body perfectly still. The footsteps paused somewhere outside the chamber. Then came the scrape of stone against stone, followed by a man's voice low enough to barely carry through the tunnel. I know somebody is down here. Caleb's pulse slowed into the calm, dangerous rhythm he remembered from years working search operations at night. Atlas glanced once toward him, waiting. Caleb rested one steady hand against the dog's shoulder in the darkness while the stranger's footsteps moved closer through the old underground passage. The footsteps stopped just outside the hidden chamber. Silence followed so completely that Caleb could hear water dripping somewhere deeper beneath the mountain. Atlas remained motionless beside him, every muscle tight beneath his fur, eyes fixed toward the thin line of gray light leaking under the stone doorway. Caleb's hand rested lightly against the German shepherd's shoulder, steadying both of them in the dark. Then the voice came again, older this time. Tired. You found Elijah's vault, did you not? Caleb said nothing at first. His instincts still searched for danger inside the silence between each word. Slowly, he reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness toward the doorway. An old man stood there with both hands visible at his sides. Thin frame, weathered denim jacket, white beard rough against a deeply lined face. He looked somewhere near 70 years old, though the mountains had probably added another decade onto him. Atlas did not bark. That alone told Caleb more than words could. The old man squinted against the flashlight. Easy there, he murmured softly toward the dog. You look just like Bear did. Caleb lowered the beam slightly. Who are you? The man stepped carefully into the chamber, boots scraping softly against the stone floor. Name is Harvey Bell. Used to work the mines back when Elijah Reed was still alive. His eyes drifted slowly around the hidden room before settling on the journal in Caleb's hand. Sadness crossed his face so quietly it almost looked like exhaustion. I wondered if somebody would ever find this place again. Caleb studied him carefully. You followed me. Harvey gave a faint shrug. Saw Grayson's people watching town this morning. Figured if they were nervous, there had to be a reason. Atlas stepped forward slowly and sniffed the old man's hand. Harvey smiled faintly, rubbing the dog gently behind the ear. Good dog. Caleb finally relaxed enough to breathe normally again. Then tell me the truth. Harvey looked toward the shelves filled with records and old maps. Truth is this town buried a good man because rich people were afraid of him. The old man walked slowly toward the photograph of Elijah Reed and the German shepherd resting beneath the folded flag. Elijah found out Grayson Mining covered up structural damage after the collapse in '72. 12 men died underground. Company blamed unstable rock. Harvey shook his head slowly. But Elijah had proof the supports were ignored to save money. Caleb glanced toward the journal again. So they tried to silence him. Harvey's silence answered first. Then quietly. Elijah planned to take the records to Reno. Federal investigators. He trusted the sheriff at first. The old man's jaw tightened beneath his beard. Big mistake. The lantern above them creaked softly as cold air drifted through the chamber. Atlas suddenly moved toward the far shelves, nose working carefully along the lower drawers. Harvey watched the dog closely. Bear used to do that too, he said quietly. Caleb looked up. Bear. Harvey nodded toward the photograph. Elijah's shepherd. Smartest search dog I ever saw. That dog stayed outside the cave house for weeks after Elijah disappeared. Folks said every night he would sit facing the canyon road waiting for his owner to come home. Caleb felt something heavy settle inside his chest. Atlas paused suddenly at the bottom drawer beneath the shelf. Caleb crouched beside him and pulled it open. Inside rested a reel-to-reel tape recorder wrapped in cloth beside several audio tapes labeled with dates from 1972. Harvey's eyes widened slowly. Lord. Caleb picked up the first tape carefully. Written confession. W.G. His pulse slowed instantly. Walter Grayson recorded himself. Harvey stared at the tape like he was looking at a ghost. Elijah told me once he had insurance in case something happened to him. Caleb turned the tape over in his hands. Dust clung to the old plastic edges beneath the flashlight beam. Somewhere outside the chamber, faintly echoing through the tunnel, came the distant sound of an engine approaching the canyon road above them. Atlas lifted his head immediately. Then another sound followed. Car doors opening. The sound of car doors slamming echoed faintly through the canyon above them, followed by muffled voices carried down through the old mining tunnels. Caleb immediately slipped the audio tapes and Elijah's journal into his duffel bag, while Harvey extinguished the weak lantern glow beside the shelves. Darkness folded around them once more. Atlas stood completely still near the hidden doorway, ears sharp, breathing slow and controlled. Caleb could hear gravel crunching somewhere outside the cave house now. At least 3 people. Maybe more. Grayson's men. Caleb whispered. Harvey nodded once. Nobody else comes up this canyon after dark. The old man's voice carried no panic. Only the weary certainty of someone who had spent decades expecting this moment to arrive. Above them, a door creaked open inside the cave house. Heavy footsteps crossed the old wooden floorboards. Dust drifted from the tunnel's ceiling with each movement. Caleb's pulse settled into that calm, dangerous rhythm he remembered from his canine days. Fear did not help you think. Atlas glanced back toward him, waiting for direction. Caleb rested one hand lightly against the dog's neck. Stay close. The voices upstairs sounded clearer now. Search everything. Another voice answered. Boss said he found something. Harvey quietly motioned deeper into the hidden chamber. There is another tunnel. Caleb looked surprised. Harvey pointed toward the rear wall behind the shelves. Emergency exit Elijah built after the mine collapse. Leads out through the eastern ridge. Atlas moved first, already sniffing toward the narrow gap hidden behind old crates. Caleb followed quickly while the sounds above grew louder. Somebody overturned furniture upstairs. Glass shattered somewhere inside the cave house. But beneath the noise came another sound. A deep bark. Atlas had stopped halfway through the hidden passage, staring back toward the tunnel entrance. Caleb crouched beside him. What is it? The German shepherd growled softly now, low and protective. Then Caleb heard it too. Not anger. Not threats. One of the men upstairs was talking about Elijah Reed. Laughing. Old fool should have burned those records when he had the chance. The words settled heavily in the darkness around them. Harvey lowered his eyes. For 50 years they made this town believe Elijah disappeared because he lost his mind. Caleb tightened his grip on the duffel strap. Not anymore. The emergency tunnel narrowed sharply as they moved deeper beneath the mountain. Cold air rushed through cracks overhead, carrying the scent of pine and rain from the opposite ridge. Atlas led the way carefully through the darkness while Caleb held the flashlight low against the stone floor. Finally, a faint gray light appeared ahead. They emerged behind a cluster of cedar trees overlooking the canyon from the eastern slope. Night had fully settled over Blackstone Ridge now. The town lights flickered dimly far below like tired candles against the desert darkness. Harvey leaned heavily against a tree, catching his breath. Caleb looked back toward the cave house. 3 vehicles sat near the canyon entrance. Men moved through the porch carrying flashlights. Searching. They are scared, Harvey whispered quietly. Caleb frowned. Scared of what? Harvey looked toward the duffel bag resting against Caleb's shoulder. Truth lasts longer than power. For a moment nobody spoke. Wind moved softly through the pines around them, while thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the mountains. Atlas sat beside Caleb, silently watching the canyon below. The same posture from the photograph. Loyal. Steady. Waiting. Caleb reached into the duffel and pulled out one of the tapes. Written confession. W.G. He stared at the faded label beneath the moonlight. Somewhere inside that small reel sat the voice of a man who buried families, stole land, and erased another Marine from history. Caleb thought about Elijah Reed sitting alone inside that cave decades earlier, hiding evidence while the town slowly turned against him. He thought about Bear waiting outside the cave house night after night for an owner who never came home. Atlas gently pressed his head against Caleb's arm. A simple gesture. Quiet. Faithful. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Sometimes the world leaves good men buried beneath silence because silence is easier for everyone else to live with. But not forever. He looked toward Harvey. Tomorrow morning, we take these records public. Harvey gave a faint, uncertain nod. You really think people will listen now? Caleb glanced down at Atlas beside him. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected the distant town lights below like small, steady fires in the dark. They will when they hear Elijah tell the truth himself. Morning sunlight spread slowly across Blackstone Ridge like warmth returning to an old wound. The town gathered quietly outside the small community hall near Main Street, drawn by rumors moving faster than fear for the first time in decades. Old miners stood beside mechanics and waitresses. Elderly women clutched coffee cups beneath worn jackets while younger families whispered to one another beneath the cool desert breeze. Nobody quite understood why Caleb Turner had called everyone there. But they came anyway. Maybe because deep down, the town had grown tired of carrying silence. Caleb stood near the front steps beside Atlas, while Harvey unloaded dusty record boxes from the truck bed. The German shepherd sat calmly at Caleb's side, amber eyes watching the crowd with quiet patience. Several people recognized the old Grayson mining seals stamped across the recovered documents. Unease moved through the gathering like wind through dry grass. Across the street, the black SUV remained parked beneath the shade of a dead cottonwood tree. But this morning, nobody inside stepped out. Caleb carried the tape recorder carefully into the hall, while townspeople slowly followed behind him. The room smelled faintly of old wood polish, dust, and stale coffee lingering from years of council meetings. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting pale stripes across the floorboards. Harvey connected the old reel-to-reel machine with trembling hands while the room settled into nervous silence. Atlas remained beside Caleb near the stage, never moving far from him. Finally, Harvey pressed the play button. Static crackled softly through the speakers first. Then came a man's voice. Older, calm, certain. Walter Grayson. If anybody hears this recording, then Elijah Reed was right about me. The room froze completely. Even the air itself seemed to stop moving. Walter's voice continued through the static. He spoke about falsified land deeds, illegal tunnels hidden beneath the mine, unsafe blasting approved to protect profits. He admitted county officials were paid to remain silent after the collapse in 1972. Then came the final words that settled deepest into the room. Elijah Reed tried to stop me because he believed people mattered more than silver. I told him men like him do not survive in towns owned by money. Somebody in the crowd began crying quietly near the back row. An old miner removed his hat slowly and lowered his head. Caleb looked around the room and saw the same expression on nearly every face. Not shock, grief. The kind that comes when people realize truth was standing beside them all along and they chose comfort instead. Harvey stepped forward carefully. Elijah never abandoned this town, he said softly. This town abandoned him. Silence answered him. Heavy, honest. Then slowly, one by one, people began approaching the boxes of records laid across the tables. Families found stolen property deeds, old photographs, letters from relatives long believed forgotten beneath the mine collapse. The cave house had not hidden treasure beneath the mountain. It had hidden memory. Outside, the black SUV quietly drove away without a sound. No threats. No confrontation, just retreat, because some battles end not with revenge, but with the simple refusal to stay buried anymore. By late afternoon, sunlight warmed the canyon cliffs above the cave house once again. Caleb sat on the porch steps beside Atlas while fresh wind moved gently through the sagebrush below. The old place no longer felt haunted now, just peaceful, like a man's long unfinished prayer had finally been heard. Harvey had already spoken with the county about protecting the land as a historical site honoring Elijah Reed and the rescue workers lost in the collapse. But Caleb had made one request of his own. A small wooden sign now rested beside the cave entrance. Atlas House. Canine Rescue and Recovery. Atlas lay beside Caleb's boots, eyes half closed beneath the golden evening light. Caleb reached down slowly and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You found all of this," he whispered. Atlas looked up at him quietly, tail brushing once against the porch wood. Beyond the canyon, the desert stretched endless beneath the fading sun, while somewhere overhead a hawk circled peacefully through the open sky. And for the first time in a very long while, Caleb Turner no longer felt like a man who had lost everything. Because sometimes God leaves small lights buried in the darkest places. And sometimes those lights walk on four paws.